He almost walked past her. He almost walked past her. One more step, and he never would have found the girl who'd change everything. No home, no family, no one looking for her, just a stranger, and a choice that would take 15 years to pay off. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know her past. But he knew one thing: she wasn't leaving hungry again.
15 years later, the girl with no home walked back through the doors, this time to save the man who gave her one.
They tried to take his empire while he couldn't fight back. They forgot.
He raised the one person who never stops fighting. This fighting.
If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a single act of kindness comes back 15 years later to save a man's entire life's work, stay with me until the end, because this story will remind you why some debts can never be measured in money. If this story moves you, hit like and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Thomas Reed had built Reed Steelworks with his bare hands, not metaphorically, literally. He had started as a 19-year-old apprentice welder on the factory floor. His own father once swept, and by the time he was 32, he owned the place outright, buying out the aging founder who had no children willing to inherit the grease and the debt and the sleepless nights that came with running a mid-sized steel fabrication plant in a Rust Belt town that most of America had stopped paying attention to. He had a wife once, Mary Ann, who used to bring him coffee at the loading dock at 6 in the morning before her shift at the hospital. She died of an aneurysm when Thomas was 39, sudden and merciless, and after that he poured everything he had into the factory because it was the only thing that still made sense to him. No children. No family beyond 211 employees who depended on him to keep the lights on and the paycheck steady. That was the life Thomas Reed had built for himself. Solitary, exhausting, purposeful, until the night everything changed. It was late October, the kind of cold that gets into your bones before the calendar admits it's actually winter. Rain had been falling for 6 hours straight, the kind of rain that turns gutters into rivers and makes every streetlight look like it's she's underwater. Thomas was locking up the factory after a long shift, keys in one hand, collar turned up against the wind, when he saw something under the loading dock overhang that made him stop cold. At first he thought it was a bag of garbage someone had dumped. Then it moved. He crouched down slowly, the way you'd approach a frightened animal, and found a little girl curled into herself, no older than 8, soaked to the bone, lips tinged blue from the cold. She flinched the second she saw him, scrambling backward until she hit the brick wall, eyes wide with a kind of fear that no 8-year-old should ever know how to have. Thomas didn't reach for her. He just knelt there in the rain and said the only thing that felt true: "You're not in trouble. I just don't want you to freeze out here." It took 20 minutes of him talking low and steady, telling her about nothing in particular, the factory, the rain, a dog he used to have, before she let him get close enough to wrap his jacket around her shoulders. Her name was Lily, she finally whispered. She didn't know her last name. She didn't know where her mother had gone, only that it had been 3 days since anyone had come looking for her, and before that, months of moving between shelters and a car that eventually got towed with all their belongings still inside it. Thomas Reed had never so much as considered being a father again. He had convinced himself that chapter of his life had closed with Mary Ann. But something about the way Lily flinched when he offered her his hand, the way she counted the marked stairs under her breath like she was bracing for them to disappear, it cracked something open in him that he didn't know was still capable of cracking. He took her home that night not because he had a plan, but because the alternative, leaving her there, wasn't a decision he was capable of making. The paperwork took months. Emergency foster placement first. Caseworkers who looked at a 44-year-old widower running a steel factory with deep suspicion, home visits, background checks, character references from men on his factory floor who'd never seen Thomas cry until the day the wood option was finalized, and he had to leave the courthouse hallway to do it in private. But 8 months after that rainy October night, Lily Reed became her legal name, and the girl star who had once counted stairs waiting for the ground to disappear beneath her finally had a floor that wasn't going anywhere. Raising her wasn't easy. She had nightmares for years. She hoarded food in her room, long after she had every reason to trust there would be more. She flinched at raised voices, even when nobody was angry. Thomas learned patience he never knew a man could have, learned to sit outside her door at 2 in the morning without saying anything, just so she'd know someone was there. He learned to braid hair badly and get better at it. He learned parent-teacher conferences and school plays, and the particular terror of watching a girl who was once invisible to the world stand center stage and refuse to be invisible ever again. Lily was sharp, sharper than Thomas had words for. By 12, she was correcting his grammar. By 15, she was reading his factory's contracts for fun, asking him pointed questions about supplier agreements that made his lawyer raise an eyebrow. Thomas used to joke that she had a courtroom mind trapped in a kid's body, and Lily, in her quiet, deliberate way, decided somewhere around 16 that the joke wasn't a joke at all. It was a plan. She wanted to be a lawyer, not the kind who chased ambulances or negotiated corporate mergers for people who already had too much. She wanted to be the kind who stood up for people who had nothing standing between them and the kind systems trying to crush them. Thomas never asked her directly if that was about her own beginning. He didn't have to. She got into a respected state university on a partial scholarship, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest because Thomas offered to pay and she refused, insisting she wanted to earn it herself the way he'd earned the factory. 4 years later, law school, top of her class in contract and corporate litigation, an area of true law that seemed almost too coincidentally suited to the world her father had spent his life in. Thomas flew out for every milestone he could: graduation, her first mock trial win, the day she to pass the bar exam, and called him sobbing with joy from a parking lot outside the testing center. He kept every voicemail, but while Lily was building her career 3 states away, something darker had been quietly building back home. Reed Steelworks had grown over the years, expanding from 1 modest facility to 3, supplying structural steel components to construction firms across 4 states, employing over 600 people by the time Thomas turned 58. Success brought partners, and 8 years earlier, Thomas had taken on an investor named Gerald Whitcomb to fund the 3rd facility's expansion, a decision that had seemed sound at the time, backed by good numbers and a smooth-talking man who knew exactly what to say to a factory owner drowning in expansion costs. What Thomas hadn't fully understood, buried deep in the fine print of an agreement he'd trusted his own attorney to review, was a clause granting Whitcomb expanded control rights if Thomas's capacity to manage day-to-day operations was ever formally called into question. Thomas had a mild stroke that spring, not severe. His speech was slightly slower for a few weeks. His left hand occasionally trembled, and doctors cleared him for full activity within 2 months. But Whitcomb saw an opening he'd apparently been waiting years for. He filed a petition in civil court seeking an emergency competency review and temporary transfer of operational control of Reed Steelworks into his own hands. Citing Thomas's medical episode, a handful of cherry-picked emails where Thomas had seemed confused or slow to respond, and testimony from a plant manager Whitcomb had quietly been grooming for months. The petition, if granted, would strip Thomas of decision-making authority over the company he had built from nothing, hand it to Whitcomb under the guise of protective stewardship, and, buried in an amendment nobody outside Whitcomb's legal team had noticed, authorize the sale of 2 of the 3 facilities to a holding company that, it would later come out, Whitcomb partially owned. Thomas found out about the filing the way most people find out their world is collapsing. A certified letter, dense with legal language, giving him 14 days to respond before a judge would rule. He was terrified, humiliated, and for the first time since the night he found Lily under that loading dock, he felt something close to helpless. He called the company's longtime attorney, a good man but a generalist, out of his depth against Whitcomb's specialized corporate litigation team. Thomas told himself he'd manage. He always managed. But alone in his kitchen that night, staring at documents whose language felt designed to make him feel stupid, he did something he hadn't wanted to do. Not because he doubted her, but because he never wanted his daughter to have to fight for him the way he'd once had to fight for her. He called Lily. She didn't hesitate for a single second. She was on a flight the next morning. What followed was 11 days that Lily would later describe as the most important work of her young career, not because of the size of the company or the money at stake, though both were considerable, but because the man on the other side of the case was her father, and the man trying to take everything from him had, in Lily's exact words to her senior partner when she requested emergency leave, picked the wrong family to underestimate. She dove into the case files, cross-referencing Whitcomb's petition against the original investment agreement, and found what Thomas's exhausted attorney had missed. The competency clause had been drafted in a way that violated state statutes on fiduciary overreach, requiring an independent medical evaluation before any competency petition could even be filed, an evaluation Whitcomb had conveniently skipped. She also found something else: financial records suggesting Whitcomb had begun quietly transferring assets and lining up buyers for the two facilities weeks before Thomas's stroke had even occurred. Evidence that this wasn't a protective measure born of concern, but a plan that had been waiting for any excuse to be executed. The morning of the hearing, Thomas sat at the defense table in a gray suit that no longer fit him quite right, hands folded tightly, looking every one of his 58 years and then some. He hadn't slept. He kept glancing at the door, and when it swung open and Lily walked in, sharp, composed, dark hair pulled back, moving with the same fast, purposeful stride she'd had since she was 16 years old, arguing with him about supplier contracts at the kitchen table. Something in his chest loosened for the first time in 11 days. She didn't sit beside him as a daughter. She sat beside him as his attorney of record, and for the next 90 minutes, the courtroom watched Gerald Whitcomb's case unravel, piece by piece. Lily dismantled the competency claim first, walking the judge through the statutory requirement Whitcomb's team had ignored, watching the color drain slightly from opposing counsel's face as they realized the entire petition was procedurally defective before it even reached the merits. Then she laid out the financial records, the pre-stroke asset transfers, the undisclosed partial ownership in the buying holding company, the conflict of interest so blatant that the judge asked Whitcomb's attorney twice to confirm she was reading the documents correctly. Whitcomb, sitting rigid in his $3,000 suit, watched a plan 8 years in the making collapse in under 2 hours, dismantled by the very man he'd underestimated, and the daughter he never knew existed. The judge didn't just deny Whitcomb's petition. She referred the asset transfer evidence to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential fraud, and ordered Whitcomb's investment stake frozen pending investigation, a ruling that would, in the following months, unravel his position at Reed Steelworks entirely and open him up to civil liability from other investors he'd apparently tried similar maneuvers with before. Outside the courthouse, under a gray October sky not unlike the one from 15 years earlier, Thomas Reed stood on the steps with his daughter, still in her blazer, folder tucked under her arm, and he didn't say anything about the case. He didn't talk about the company, or Whitcomb, or what came next for the business. He just looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had that first night when she was 8 years old and shivering under a loading dock, except now there was nothing left to protect her from. She was the one protecting him. "I found you under a pallet in the rain," he finally said, voice rough, "and I didn't have a single plan for what came next. I just knew I couldn't leave you there." Lily reached over and took his hand, the same way he'd once reached for hers on a kitchen table 30 seconds after meeting her. "You didn't just save me that night," she said. "You spent 15 years making sure I'd know how to save somebody too." Reed Steelworks kept its 3 facilities. 600 jobs stayed exactly where they belonged. And Thomas Reed, who had spent a lifetime believing that family was something he'd lost the chance for the day Marianne died, walked down those courthouse steps beside the daughter he'd found in the rain, understanding for the first time that the empire he'd built was never really the steel, or the contracts, or the 3 facilities bearing his name. It was the girl who once had nowhere to go, who grew up to make sure he always would. Some debts, it turns out, aren't paid back in money. They're paid back in showing up, in fighting for the person who once fought for you, in choosing, the same way it was once chosen for you, that no one you love gets left out in the rain. If this story reminded you that kindness always finds its way back, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.